Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you guys had a good Thanksgiving break. So we are about halfway through with this chapter on PCA. The last lecture was pretty mathematical. This one will be a little bit more fun. I just want to sort of summarize what we found at the end of the last lecture. So basically, PCA is a way of compressing features so that instead of having d dimensions like the raw features do, you can squeeze them down to essentially fewer features. And then with those fewer features, the hope is, there's different reasons why you might want to do that, but the hope is that you don't lose too much from the raw features, but you are going to lose something. So I want to first clarify that PCA is not typically used as a feature selection technique. Feature selection, if you remember, we talked about that back in Unit 4. That's like where you have D raw features, and then you want to find some subset of them to use, and then a subset to throw away. And there's several reasons why you might want to do feature selection. Number one, you might want to reduce the variance to improve prediction performance. Another reason is you might want to know, for scientific reasons, like which of these features are most important. Now, in PCA, yes, you are getting fewer features, but it's not like you're selecting them. You are just coming up with some sort of linear combination of all of them, different linear combinations of them, and then at the end you have fewer features to deal with. Today we'll see one application of this is visualization. Other applications would be just reducing the complexity of the processing that you need to do, because sometimes if you have a lot of features, it takes, let's say, a long time to do support vector machine, because I think as you guys saw in the labs, it can take a while to run that. So if you can drastically reduce the number of features, that's going to run a lot faster. But you should expect the performance to be a little bit worse. So you shouldn't expect it to be better. Okay. So PCA, what we do is we have, we're approximating the original features, xi by this x hat I, and the way we construct those is we have a tall dictionary matrix that has capital R columns, and D rows, and we multiply that with this is the VR. This Z hat I is something that must have just capital R coefficients. And so here's our original X. Okay, so this is just a visualization. This is the full feature vector for the ith sample. These are our compressed features for the ith sample. And then this dictionary, we use this in common for all samples. Okay, so that's how we approximate the raw features. How do we compute these coefficients? We compute them this way. So this VR matrix, which plays a role in both parts here, that is constructed from the R principal eigenvectors of the sample covariance matrix. Once you know VR, you can compute all your compressed features by just multiplying VR transpose times your original raw features. And VR also works as the dictionary. Whenever you want to construct an approximation of your raw features, you multiply that dictionary matrix times your compressed feature vector. Okay, so that's, and then Q is our sample covariance matrix. We are saying that this is a sample covariance matrix because we're assuming that the mean has been subtracted from these xi's. If the mean was not subtracted, then to define the sample covariance matrix, you would need to subtract it from both of those terms. And a visualization of this is as follows. If you have three-dimensional features, so here we're working in a three-dimensional space, and you want to compress them down to an approximation where the features feature vectors are two-dimensional, you're essentially finding the best subspace to approximate your three-dimensional features, or the best plane here to approximate those. And then after the approximation, all of these 3D points will all be sitting in that plane. Okay, so the error of the approximation is like the error on this point would be that much, the error on this one would be that much. So this is a lossy kind of compression. You're introducing error when you do this. So that's why things should get a bit worse. On the other hand, if you take the same raw features and you say, I want to do a one-dimensional approximation, then you're approximating all these features by their projections onto this line. So here the approximation error is going to be even larger than it was with the plane. But what you get in return is you have an even simpler approximation, even more, less space, less memory is required, less computation is required. So that's the trade-off. It's like a computation/memory versus quality trade-off when you do PCA. Okay, so is the big picture sort of making sense? I know it's been a long break, so maybe you don't remember all the details. Yeah.
So the R value, so is that?
That's something we choose, capital R. Yeah. I'll talk about how to choose that on the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions about PCA? Okay. So yeah. So choosing R is important because it's the entire trade-off. In fact, if you choose R equal to the original data dimension D, then you're not going to be doing any compression at all, right? It's PCA is like doing nothing. So the hope is that you're going to compress and R is going to be less than D. Hopefully a lot less than D, but the problem is if you make R too small, you have a terrible approximation. Okay, so how can we quantify this? So we're going to do something, how do we quantify the performance as a function of the rank R? We're going to do something very similar to what we did way back in Unit 2 when we studied linear regression. So, and let's talk about the scalar, the original form of linear regression we studied. So in that case, we had this R squared. That was how we judged the performance of our linear predictors, right? And that was 1 minus RSS divided by n times sy squared. You can think of n times sy squared as the total amount of energy, or maybe you can say n times the total variance in the thing you're trying to predict, right? We're trying to predict the targets. So in the denominator here, we have something like the target variance. For PCA, we're using essentially the closest thing possible to R squared. It's now going to be called proportion of variance, but the way that it's defined is 1 minus RSS over, again, n times the variance of the thing we're trying to predict. So we're trying to predict the entire x vector, right? Every term in the x vector has a variance. This trace Q is just the sum of the covariance matrix, which is just, or the trace of the covariance, which is the sum of the individual variances for the different features. Okay, so it's a direct generalization from this to this, of the variance of the thing we're trying to predict. So it behaves in a similar way in that if you can get this POV all the way to 1, that's perfect, just like R squared was. And if POV gets closer to 0, that's really bad. It's, PCA is not doing well to explain your data. Okay, so let's probe this equation a little bit more. Are there any questions on the definition to start with? Okay, so if we plug in some of the quantities that we talked about last time we met, we can get a nice, concise expression for this that I think gives a bit more intuition. So let's start with this denominator, n times the trace of Q. So if you remember, for Q, we had this eigenvector decomposition, which was V lambda V transpose. And V was a matrix that was orthogonal, meaning V times V transpose is equal to identity, and also V transpose V is equal to identity. So one of the nice things about the trace is that you can, unlike with matrix multiplication where the order really matters, with the trace you can cyclically move things through. So we can actually, because it's inside the trace, we can move the V transpose to the front. At that point we have V transpose V, which we know is identity, at which point we can just ignore that identity matrix. And then what that does is it just gets rid of those terms, and now we have trace of the lambda matrix. The lambda matrix was the diagonal matrix containing the eigenvalues along the diagonal. And so when you take the trace of lambda, you're just literally summing up the D eigenvalues, lambda J. Okay, so that's one way we can think of this. What about the RSS? Okay, so for the RSS, we derived this expression a couple slides back. It was n times the trace of this projection matrix PB perp times Q. And PB perp, this one, was I minus the projection matrix PB. So we can plug in that, and that gives, because the trace is linear, we're now going to have n times the trace of Q minus n times the trace of PBQ. So this term we just computed there, so that's this one. And then this other term, we saw that towards the end of our derivation last time. And in fact, what we worked hard to derive was that this PB used by PCA is VR times VR transpose. It's that's how we construct this projection matrix. And as a result, the effect of that is to sort of filter out, if you will, the largest eigenvectors in Q, the capital R largest ones. And so this term here looks like this. So on the left, you're summing all the eigenvalues, and on the right, you're summing only the first capital R of them. And if it's this minus this, that means it's like you're summing from R plus 1 to the end. So these are going to be the smallest ones once you take away the capital R biggest ones. Okay, so that's the RSS. So, so now we can plug these definitions into here. So the first thing we'll do is we'll write 1 this way, just for, because it will help us in a moment. So obviously this equals 1. And then the second thing, we have RSS, which is this, divided by n trace q, which is this. Because the denominators have the same form, we can just subtract this minus this, at which point we get back the capital R largest eigenvalues. And now you can see that we have a nice expression for POV, which basically you can see directly that as R gets larger and larger, this numerator gets larger and larger, right? Because all these eigenvalues are non-negative. And as R gets closer and closer to D, this gets closer and closer to 1. Once R equals D, you can see this equals exactly 1. So it's just summing up. It's like a cumulative sum. The top, yeah, this is like a cumulative sum of the eigenvectors, eigenvalues from 1 up to R. And so as you increase R, you just get more and more of them, and this POV gets closer to 1. Okay, so we'll see an example of this coming up with the labeled faces in the wild data set, where we'll try different R's and see how this POV gets close to 1. Okay, so that's basically how we can quantify the performance of PCA and help us choose this rank R. We can look at this curve and we can see where there's a knee in the curve. That would be a good place to choose R. Okay, so any questions on this page? Okay. All right, so actually let me just skip ahead a few slides and show you that. I'll skip back to get some details, but this is the POV curve versus the number of principal components, which is for us capital R. And let's see, so just to remind you, for this data set, this 1850 is D, But it turns out that the number of samples in the data set was 1288. So as we'll see in a moment, because there's 1,288 samples only, which is actually less than D, it's a little bit unusual, right? We usually see more samples than feature dimension, but in this case, there's actually less. So because there's only 1,288 samples in our data set, that's going to place an upper bound on the rank of our factorization. And so, so 1288 is the largest R. At that point, the POV is exactly 1. But in fact, if you look at even like R equals 400, the POV is almost exactly 1. So it's really doing quite a good job here. Roughly speaking, we can compress by about a factor of 3 without almost any loss in the quality, right? So that's kind of a big win. That would mean like we can store the data set with a third of the space. We can use this compressed representation to do something like classification, and it would run a lot faster, and so on, because the features have been compressed. All right, any questions on this POV picture? Okay, so let's come back and let's cover the last technical detail that we need to get through to understand how to apply PCA, which is how to actually do the computation. So the way that I described things earlier was in terms of this matrix Q, right? This was sort of like the idea was you compute this, then you compute the eigen decomposition, you then keep the capital R largest eigenvectors and throw away everything else. So it turns out that certainly you can do that, but it's a bit wasteful computationally, because just computing this matrix can be quite an effort depending on your data set. You essentially have to do capital N outer products. So each one of these, this is a column times a row, each one of those takes D squared multiplications just to do one of these, and you have to do N times that. So if you have a big data set, this could take forever to just even make this matrix. And then let alone how, then you have to do the eigen decomposition, which takes additional effort. So it turns out that there's a shortcut based on something called the SVD. I'm curious, how many of you guys have heard of the SVD? Okay, a few, that's good. I think the SVD is one of the most useful and important decompositions in linear algebra. You've probably heard about many, many decompositions, seen them in maybe some linear algebra courses. SVD is super powerful for a number of reasons. One of the reasons it's powerful is that you can apply it to any matrix. There's a lot of decompositions where the matrix needs to be square, needs to be invertible or something. SVD you can apply no matter what. It's a way of disassembling a matrix into 3 parts. Roughly speaking, a unitary or an orthogonal matrix, a diagonal matrix, and then another unitary orthogonal matrix. So intuitively, the thing about these orthogonal matrices is that they function as rotations. So if I give you an orthogonal matrix, that's a matrix where all the columns are orthogonal to each other, all the rows are orthogonal to each other, and all the rows and columns have norm 1. If you multiply a vector by this matrix, what it does is it just rotates the vector in whatever dimensional space you're working with. It does not change the length of the vector at all. It preserves the length perfectly. So you can think of it as a rotation matrix. So any kind of matrix where you just want to rotate a vector in this space without changing its length, in order to do that, you can build one of these orthogonal matrices to do it. So here, if you think about multiplying a vector by x, what we're saying is you can equivalently do a sequence of 3 operations. First, rotate that vector by v. Second, S is going to be a diagonal matrix, which means after you've rotated it, you scale each of the coefficients, because that's multiplication by a diagonal matrix, followed by one more rotation. So it's rotate, scale, and rotate again. Any matrix can be thought of as doing those 3 steps. And the SVD is what pulls apart that matrix into those 3 components. Okay, a few more details. There's basically 2 forms of the SVD. There's the standard SVD and one that sometimes is called the economy SVD. That's definitely what it's called in MATLAB. So let's start with the standard SVD. So again, this is any matrix X. And let's say that just for purposes of our discussion, like always in this course, X has n rows and d columns. And let's denote the rank of X. The rank is basically from linear algebra. It's like the number of linearly independent columns or rows in that matrix. So the standard SVD decomposes X using square U and V matrices. Let me draw a couple pictures. There's so one way that this can work out is, let's say that you have a wide X matrix. So that means that the SVD does a square matrix where this dimension agrees with this dimension, followed by another diagonal matrix which has the same dimension as the original one here, followed by a square matrix that must agree with this dimension. So that's what you get with a wide matrix. Now, if you have a tall matrix, then you're going to have square, something the original size, and square again. Okay, so these are different incarnations. Of course, if the original matrix is square, then it's just square equals square, square, square. So these are sort of tall versus wide. And okay, so let me also emphasize, so these matrices here are diagonal, meaning there are possibly non-zero coefficients along that diagonal, but everywhere else is zeros. And then importantly, these U and V are orthogonal. These are these rotation type matrices. If they were complex valued, you would call them unitary. When they're real valued, you tend to call them orthogonal. But if you said unitary, someone would understand what you mean. Yeah, and then this S matrix is again diagonal. And these things along the diagonal are called the singular values. And the singular values are ordered from large to small. You can have zero valued. They're all positive, but some of them can be exactly zero. The number of them, so this is, if we say that there's m of them, you can see from these pictures, the number of them along this diagonal is going to be the minimum of this dimension or this dimension. Right, so in this wide case, the number along the diagonal matches this. In the tall case here, the number along the diagonal matches this dimension. Okay. So that's basically how the standard SVD is defined. Again, it's like rotation, scale, rotation. The scaling, you could scale an entry all the way to zero, but it's always some sort of positive scaling. Okay, so that's the SVD. On the next slide, I'll talk about how we're going to use this to do PCA, but it's a shortcut. This will essentially give us exactly what we need for PCA also. That's why we're talking about it. But it also is very useful in many other endeavors you might encounter as an engineer. Okay, any questions on this standard SVD? Sorry. Okay, so there's another form of the SVD which is more economic in terms of how many coefficients are computed and stored. The reason for this is if you think about this picture here, imagine multiplying this matrix times this matrix. Because of all these zeros here, the coefficients on that part of this matrix are irrelevant. All those zeros here will multiply those and cancel whatever's there. So basically, these coefficients are never directly used in the decomposition. You don't actually need them. The same thing happens here. So you don't actually need those. The ones you really need to worry about are these. All the other ones are essentially killed by the zeros. So the economy SVD only computes the coefficients in the U and V matrices that you actually need. There's something else that can happen too. Some of these coefficients along the diagonal could be 0. So let's say that the last half of them along the diagonal are 0. Well, that means that the last half of these are also unused. So what the economy SVD does is it only computes R columns in these matrices, and that is because when you have an R rank matrix here, there will be exactly R, little r, non-zero singular values. So here's the R of them. Those are the only ones that are computed here, so they're all greater than 0. No 0-valued ones are computed. And as a result, let me draw a few more pictures here. So let's take the wide case. So you can have a matrix like this. This might be like this, and like this. So these are now all non-zero. In fact, maybe let me edit these to be a little bit more clear. So I'll take out a few of them to emphasize that those are 0 down here, or they could be 0, these could be 0 here. But in this case, none of them are 0. All the ones in the diagonal are non-zero. So that's one picture. Another picture, maybe a square matrix, could possibly look like this. It's a square matrix that maybe is not full rank. In that case, if R is the rank of this matrix, then there will be this will be an R by R diagonal matrix. And then the other case is if this is tall, we need something like this, something like that, and something, oops, a little shorter, something like that. Okay. Now again, this matrix contains, that is exactly this matrix. So that means that all those columns are orthogonal to each other and unit norm. So it obeys this, but it does not obey the other one. Same thing with V. Oops, transpose on the other one. So in general, this does not hold. Okay. So, but this holds. So it has, the U and V matrices have orthogonal columns no matter what, but they just might not have enough of them to make this happen. Okay, so these are the two versions we have. And yeah, so the economy one is only computing the U and V coefficients and the S coefficients where they're actually needed. Question, yes?
In the standard one,
Mm-hmm.
when you have the long matrix and the short and the tall matrix,
Uh-huh.
I guess when you have the long one, the first thing on
This
the,
one?
Yeah.
Okay.
On the far left is a square.
Yes.
And then when you do the economy one, that first square turns into a tall matrix.
Yeah, it could be square, but it could be tall. So it's all about the rank of this matrix. So for example, the picture I drew here, the rank, which is the number of coefficients here, might be like half of the dimension. But let me draw another picture. Here's another case where you have a square, 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 where, so here, this is a full rank matrix. So all of these will be non-zero. And so this has to match this dimension, and this has to match this dimension. So this is the full rank case. The full rank case of the next one would look like this. So these would both be square. And they would have the same dimension as that. So it really depends on the rank. As you could say, like, if the rank of this matrix was no longer this dimension, then a few of these singular values would turn into 0. And as soon as those are 0, you don't actually compute them. And nor do you compute the end columns and rows of this, because they would be canceled out by those zeros. At that point, you get something that looks more like this. Okay. Yeah, so that's the SVD. It's a really convenient way to decompose things. I find it's very often useful for proofs in linear algebra. You're trying to prove something in linear algebra. If you resort to the SVD, it often exposes the structure of the problem, and you can prove it just from there. Okay, great. So probably spent enough time on this. Any questions on the SVD? Okay, so let's talk about how we can use this. So this was the matrix Q that we said led to this eigendecomposition, for which we want to pick out the capital R largest, the capital R columns in V that correspond to the largest eigenvalues in lambda. So we're going to assume that this is sorted so that the lambdas are getting smaller, or at least not increasing. So let's see how this looks if we apply the SVD. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug in the SVD for X. So for X here, that gives us USV transpose. For X transpose, that gives us V S transpose U transpose. And we immediately see that we have this U transpose U, which we know, because U is orthogonal, becomes identity, so we can basically take that out of the picture. Next, we have something like this. So if S is diagonal, S transpose is also going to be diagonal, and as a result, this matrix is going to be diagonal, at which point you can see that we have something that looks just like an eigenvalue decomposition. We have an orthogonal times diagonal times the transpose of this orthogonal. That's what we have here, orthogonal, diagonal, transpose of the orthogonal. So at that point, you can see these are exactly the same in the sense that this V is the same V that's computed in the singular value decomposition, and the eigenvalues are essentially the same as the squared singular values divided by n. And in fact, these guys were sorted just like these, from biggest to smallest. So just to summarize, lambda j is sj squared divided by n, and the V matrices are the same. So you can compute the V matrix from the SVD, and use that as the V matrix in the eigenvalue decomposition, which is what we need for PCA. So the SVD is essentially how we compute PCA. The SVD is a lot faster to compute because we don't have to create the Q matrix. That takes a lot of work. We can just work on the X matrix directly, the feature matrix directly. Just take an SVD of it. Okay, so that's why we're talking about the SVD in this unit. Okay, so now we know how to compute the PCA with SVD. But we can even do a little bit better because on this page, we were focusing on the standard SVD. But we know that in this standard SVD, that's doing maybe a bunch more work than we need because it's computing all the eigenvectors in V. We only want the first capital R of them, which might be very few. And it's computing all the eigenvalues. So maybe it can do even better. The economy SVD computes only the top R singular vectors, where the rank little r is less than or equal to the minimum of either of the two dimensions of the original X matrix. So basically, let's use the economy SVD. That's going to be less computational complexity. So essentially, this is how we do it here. You take your feature matrix, do the economy SVD. That's going to give you U, S, V transpose. And we're going to extract the first R columns of this VR transpose, call that VR. And once we have that matrix, then we know that this is how we construct our compressed feature representations. We just take that VR transpose, multiply times our features to get our Z's. So that's it. So in fact, there's a couple different ways to implement this. One of them that I think I use it at least in some of the demos is what's called the sparse SVD. And it's trying to compute, there's different algorithms that are used to compute this stuff. And some of them allow you to say, only compute the first capital R. Like this one, this standard one computes however many are needed to get the rank. So it's going to compute little r no matter what, but you actually want big R, where big R is typically much less than little r. But there's this sparse one where you just tell it what big R is. Like, I just want to compute the largest one, R equals 1. And it just computes that very quickly for you using something called the power iteration. So there's actually something even faster than this. I'll just write it here. Or use the sparse SVD to compute only the top R singular values. Okay, it's called the sparse SVD because you can use it on sparse matrices. They don't have to be sparse to use it. It works on dense matrices as well. It's just a different algorithm. Okay, so that's essentially how we can do it. So now we know how to efficient way to compute the PCA directly from that feature vector X. Any questions on this? All right, so there's one more thing I'd like to talk about, which is if you're going to use these coefficients for another downstream task like regression or classification, then you might also want to make sure that your Z coefficients are standardized. So this is totally optional because a lot of times you use PCA, you're not going to do downstream regression or classification. But if you are, then as we know, it's useful to do standardization. So let's see what extra steps are required if we want to make sure that Z are standardized. So this might use them for classification or regression. Should standardize the new feature Z. Okay, so what do we want? So what we want are two things, as we know from standardization. The sample mean, which is just the average of the ZIs across our data set. We want that to be 0. Second, we want that if we look at the jth coefficient individually, then we want the sample variance to be equal to 1. So here I'm not subtracting the mean because we know that, well, let's see. So we know that if this has been taken care of, if it's been centered, then this is sufficient to give us the variance. Okay, how do we rewrite this in terms of the language of this unit? So if you look at this QZ matrix, this is this matrix of the average outer product of the ZIs, and you think about what is on the diagonal of that matrix, those are going to be these variance terms here. So the diagonal of the autocovariance autocovariance matrix of Z, you want that to be the ones vector. So this is a bold one. Okay, so how do we do this? Or let's see what we actually get without the actual values. This is the values that we get from the SVD. Let's start by computing what is the sample mean. So the sample mean would be this. This is just plugging in our expression for ZI, right? So now I can move the sum through this VR transpose because that does not depend on I, after which we get the average of the XIs. But we said at the beginning that these are standardized, meaning that this is exactly equal to 0, which means that this whole Z bar is also 0. So that means that the way we've been doing things, we automatically satisfy this centering requirement. So that's great. We don't have to worry about any sort of mean subtraction. That's already taken care of. What about the rest of this? So let's look at this covariance matrix, which we said is defined this way. So we're going to plug in this expression for both of these again, and then move the sum inward. So now we have what we can recognize as the Q matrix on X, which we just called Q before, the covariance matrix on X. Let's, for Q, plug in our SVD. This is actually the economy SVD. So now we get an interesting thing. We have a V transpose little r times V big R. If you remember, these matrices share, the first capital R columns are identical. The only difference is that this little V little r matrix has a few extra columns. So when you multiply these together, you get this matrix that has an identity on the left and a 0 on the right. So that's what this is, and it's transposed over here. And when you apply that matrix in here, that has the effect of simply extracting the first capital R values of this. So you end up getting QZ is the diagonal of these terms Sj squared divided by n. So that's what QZ is. And so that means if you want to standardize, if you want that QZ to have a diagonal of equal to 1, all you have to do are take your z's, multiply by square root n, and divide by these s's, and you'll get what I'm calling z tilde, which is a standardized version. So this z tilde will have unit variance for all the coefficients. So we just looked at the variance of the z's and then inverted it to get the unit variance that we wanted. Okay, so notice that this is actually the square root of this, because when we compute the covariance, this whole thing will get squared. And that's why we're taking the square root of these values. Okay, so that is the end of all the ugly math. Now we can start to look at some nice pictures. Are there any questions about the standardization process? Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. It's just a simple scaling here. Okay, so let's look at some nice pictures, or a little bit of code too. So this is our labeled faces in the wild data set. So how do we work with this? Well, we take the original raw feature matrix, and we're going to subtract the mean, or we're going to compute the mean, and then subtract it, and we'll get this XS, which is like a centered version. Then we can do NumPy lineage SVD, and if we do full matrices equals false, this is how you do the economy version. If you do full matrices equal true, you get the full version. And then different from, so in MATLAB, if you do this, you get USV, where they're all matrices. In NumPy, when you do it, you get US V transpose. So that's why I'm calling this VT. It's actually a transpose version of the V matrix. And the other thing is not obvious here, is that this is actually a vector. This is not a diagonal matrix, it's just the vector of singular values S. Okay, and when we look at the shape of this, the shape is going to essentially match our data dimensions. So we had 1,850 pixels in each face, and we had a total of 1,288 faces in our data set. So because we actually had fewer samples than the feature dimension, we can do lossless compression just with 1,288 coefficients. We don't actually need to work in this full space. It's sort of, you could say, redundant. So here we saw this curve before. Proportion of variance, you can see we can do a pretty good approximation already at 300. Things do get worse as we go down, but we can take a look at some pictures to see how bad things get down over here. Okay, so now let's look at two particular faces. So these are both faces of George W. Bush. This is, on the right, this is the full, this is, the face without any compression. And then here I'm showing you the approximate faces under different levels of compression. So, and by the way, here is the mean face. So if you look over this data set, you subtract the mean of all the different faces, this is the mean face. It looks kind of interesting, just kind of like a mask or something, quite generic. So that's just the average of all the faces. The things that you can notice, notice the lighting in particular. The lighting is kind of straight from the front. There's no imbalance to the shadows and so on. Now when you look at using larger values of R, so if you do a PCA approximation with R equals 1, you can see it's very close to the mean face. It's really not enough to tell that this is George Bush. As you use 3, compressed down to 3, it's still pretty bad, but what you notice happening is you start to get the lighting, like here the lighting is coming from this direction, here the lighting is coming from this direction. As you use more and more coefficients, the face really does start to emerge. As humans, you can recognize it maybe somewhere in this vicinity here. You can start to tell who this is. And as you get to 300, we said 400 is almost perfect. 300 is also quite good. Yeah, it's not perfect. Some of the wrinkles are gone and so on, but it's pretty good, right? So you can compress here. This would be a compression factor of 4 from the full precision data. So with that compression factor, you can do quite well. Just for comparison, like if you think about MP3, which is much more sophisticated kind of audio compression, there you're usually getting roughly, I think, around 10. There's different, you can use different amounts of compression there too. But so here it's even though this is PCA, it's really simple. There's already quite a bit of redundancy in faces that you can get decent compression with just this very simple linear approach. Okay, so that's approximation versus R. Now let's look at the principal components themselves, which are kind of interesting to look at. These things are coined eigenfaces. So here we have the mean on the left. Then it says the most important variation from the mean in this data set is this. And so this is really something about lighting, I think. It's sort of like, is the lighting coming from above or is the lighting coming from below? Because that's sort of the main thing that I think this is providing. Then the next most important eigenface is actually something that I think corresponds to, is the lighting coming from this side. And then this other one, the next most important one, is the lighting coming from down there, and so on. And then after that point, then you start to get some more face tweaks where maybe this might be pulling in the eyes and nose towards the center a little bit. It's hard to say, but it's interesting to look at how you can decompose a face into these orthogonal components and then say, if I want to come up with essentially the best 6 dictionary elements to approximate all the faces in my data set linearly, this is them. This is exactly what they are. So it's sort of a fun visual. Any questions on this? Okay, is this sort of making sense? Is it helping to explain what PCA is doing? All right. Okay. As we said, optionally, you could use these compressed faces for classification. So in this case, it would mean, taking this 4x compressed data set and seeing, can you do classification of George Bush versus Gerhard Schroeder versus the other people in the data set. And for this data set, we do have labels, so we can do this. You don't need to have any labels to do PCA, so this is just something extra we can do with this data set. So we do the standard things. We split into training and test. We center the training data. We do our SVD, the economy one. And then we choose how many principal components. So actually, we're going to use just 100 to see how we do. So that's a compression factor of like 15 or so, 16. So there's quite a bit of compression. Can we still do classification even with 1/16 of the features? So what we can do is we get this V transpose matrix, and we're going to take now the first 100 rows of this and ignore all the other ones. So eigenfaces will be our dictionary, and then to compute our Z coefficients, which are our compressed representation, we basically do X transpose times eigenfaces transpose, and we get this Z matrix. Then standardization is quite easy. Let's see. So S is going to be, those are the singular values. So here we're just taking the first 100 singular values, dividing Z by those, and then multiplying by square root times the number of samples to get our standardized coefficients. So now our Z's are standardized. We can safely do feature selection and all that sort of stuff. And in fact, we're going to use an SVM classifier with a radial basis function kernel. As we know, we have 2 important parameters to adjust, the regularization C and the kernel width gamma. So we can do this in 3 lines in sklearn. We're mainly going to use this grid search CV command. We tell it this is the SVC classifier we're going to use. For the parameter grid, we made a grid with 6 values of C and looks like 7 values logarithmically spaced of gamma. Both of them are actually logarithmically spaced. And cross-validation, we'll do 5-fold CV. And that's it. We just do CLF fit. We let this run for a while. It's feasible to do this without too much work with 100 because we used compression down to 100. If you try this with the full data set, it would take a lot longer. I've never done that. I don't know how long it would take, too long. But we can do this. And So then, after we train our classifier, we want to apply exactly the same standardization to the test data. So notice that when we do this test standardization, we're using the training mean, not the test mean. We're compressing the test faces using the same eigenvalues computed on the training. We're doing the same standardization based on the scaling from the training. And then we can do our prediction to see how well did we predict on the test data. And on the test data, we got 83% accuracy, on the training, 85. Those are pretty comparable. So it looks like things were working pretty well. Now, I don't know exactly what the performance is without any PCA compression. It's probably going to be a bit better, but it takes forever to run, so I never waited that long. But I do want to point out that there is a major issue with PCA, that it really, in some cases, can absolutely kill your classifier. And I think this picture on the right shows when this can happen. So this is just a warning. It's not generally a good thing to do. So let's look at this. This is just a toy example, but it illustrates the point. So here we have two-dimensional feature data. Class 1 is to the southwest, class 2 to the northeast. If you didn't do any compression, you could easily classify this, right? You just put your classifier boundary right here. Data is linearly separable, perfect classification. Now let's say you want to do PCA. Since you're starting in 2 dimensions, the only thing you can do is squeeze it down to 1 dimension, right? So PCA is going to try to find the 1-dimensional subspace, the line, which is the best fit to this data set. So where's that line going to be? How do I orient a line so that I get the smallest projection error? Which way? Is it going to be up and down, this way, this way? What do you think? This way, right? Because the projection error is smallest in that direction. Right? If I do it this way, my projection error is going to be larger. So this is actually going to give me the smallest projection error. But now you can see how this absolutely killed my classifier, because if I project all the points onto this line, then the 1s and the 2s got completely mixed together. It's impossible to separate them now. So PCA, its objective was minimizing RSS. The classifier's objective was keeping the data separable in the classes. So they're totally clashing in this case. If you did PCA here, it would absolutely kill your classifier. So this is just a warning. This is sort of a worst case. It's usually not going to be this bad, but it can be this bad. So there are other ways to do dimensionality reduction. So one kind of famous classical approach is called LDA, linear discriminant analysis. And if you applied LDA to this data set, it would do things perfectly. It would learn to compress in the other way. It would compress along down to that line. So all the 1s would be here, all the 2s would be there. You get still perfect classification. So the point is that there are other things out there. PCA is not the only approach. LDA is a classic approach. It is something that is more tractable, but it's not something that I see used a lot in contemporary machine learning, so I'm not going to get into any details. Just want you guys to know that it's out there, and if you want to study it further, you can do that on your own. Let's see. The very last thing that I wanted to talk about is data visualization. And for data visualization, the idea is if you can squeeze down to 2 dimensions, things become very visualizable, right? 2 dimensions, we can clearly see structure. So a nice toy example is, what if you start with MNIST? MNIST had 28 by 28 pictures, right? So 28 squared features. That's a lot of features. I think is that 384? So it's a lot of features. Can I squeeze that down to 2 features and still see the different digits separated? So this is what happens if you do PCA down to 2 dimensions for MNIST. These colors show you the different MNIST classes. So for example, the 0s ended up here, the 1s ended up here, the 9s are here, and so on. So it didn't do a perfect job of separating the data. It mashed things together, which is not unexpected since you're just squeezing things down to 2 dimensions, right? You would say, like, how good would you expect your classifier to be for MNIST if you squeezed those 384 pixels down to 2. Probably not very good. So, but there are some nice trends you can see here. So this is a visualization of the first principal component. So blue would be positive, gray is 0, and red is negative. So you can see that the first principal component for MNIST is really distinguishing between zeros and ones. Right? So it's sort of like as you move in this direction, this gets more positive. As you move in this direction, which is negatives, okay, so here's 0, negatives, then this red turns positive. Now, that's the first principal component. The second principal component is a little bit more detailed, but you can see what it's going to do is it's going to try to fill in some other details, like, for example, the 9s. So 9s, we want to close the loop on the top. So it's kind of like a 1, but then with this little thing on the top. So you can see that if you go up and to the left you get the more stick-like thing, and as you go up, you get you get this part. So that helps complete the 9. On the other hand, if you go down this way, that would be the 2s. Then you start to get this part over here, the 2. So you can see how PCA is sort of trying to disassemble MNIST into its most important components. So it's just a nice visual. Very quickly, last slide. Obviously, this is not working that well, right? It's not really exposing the class structure in MNIST. The question is, are there better things, more sophisticated things that do this? The answer is definitely. So the ones that are most popular today are probably T-SNE and UMAP. I'm not going to get into how they work, but they try to reduce a high-dimensional data set down to 2 dimensions just for visualization, just so you can get a sense of maybe how well clustered things are. So, for example, if you apply T-SNE to MNIST, you get this picture, which does a pretty good job of splitting out all the different classes. Now, it did this without knowing anything about the data set. It did not know that there were 10 classes or it did not have any labels. It just said, let me try to non-linearly warp the data to try to squeeze things together into little clusters. We'll talk more about clustering in the next unit, but you can see it did a pretty good job. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. An even more modern one that worked even a little bit better here is UMAP. So one of the applications for these is if somebody gives you a data set, let's say a classification data set, and you just have no idea whether whether you can even do anything with it. Maybe like things are just so interwoven that there's absolutely no way to pull things apart. You might say, well, as a first step, let me just take a look at it with T-SNE or UMAP. Does it expose any structure? Does it make it seem like there is something there to classify? And so what you could then do is maybe try some other feature transformations to try to get you to something more interesting. So, and sometimes this is an issue. You might get like a really weird data set where it's high dimensional. You don't have enough samples to really train a neural network with it. So you're looking for shortcuts, ways to squash it down, to do some feature compression to it just on your own. And these tools can be a little bit handy when you're doing that. Okay, sorry for going so late today, but that's it for this unit. And then we'll spend the rest of the week on clustering. And then I think we should be able to finish by the end of the week and not have any class next week. So that's the goal. See you guys on Wednesday.